This is Deep Down, and I'm your host, Jordan Hunt. I'm a composer, vocalist, multi-instrumentalist, and self-releasing artist. You might also know me as former violinist in the Irrepressibles, as the long-standing musical companion to Grammy-nominated Olivia Chaney, or as a musical and associate director of the Theodem's Company. I delve deep as we explore the creative process and life through the lens of a musician, unravelling universal ideas and enigmas through some of my songs and lyrics, and through some of the profound moments that have shaped me. Join me deep down as we embark on this journey together, in search of answers to the elusive question, what do you really feel deep down? Music and nighttime are such beautiful partners for me, and I always prefer the mystery of the dark to access my inner creative world. But is it a necessary state to be able to write at all? And why is it that the absence of light allows us to access a more boundless interior horizon? After the 8-hour writing stints of my younger days, deep down, is there any wisdom to be gleaned from this way of creating, and how does it all connect? Welcome, listeners. I'm excited to go deep down with you and share some more thoughts about the creative and sometimes pragmatic, not so creative life of a musician. For all the creativity in my life, I'm deeply pragmatic. Apparently my astrological reading for my specific birthday says I'm the birthday of the enigmatic pragmatist, and I've always connected to the pragmatic part of that reading. I was always confused about the enigmatic half, as I have such a compulsion to try to communicate my inner world with people. But as I age, the more I realise we'll never truly know the inner world of someone else, no matter how hard they may try to explain or how many podcast episodes they record. Perhaps I'm only enigmatic from the outside. Perhaps it's my music that fulfills that half of my personality. Either way, I'm already off topic. Something I've had at the back of my mind for years is this very particular relationship I have to working at night, and especially that sort of deep flow, solitary work that I feel sometimes I can only access as the daylight fades and nighttime is upon us. These days I rarely work past dinner time, just supper time for southerners, as I simply don't have the energy I had when I was younger. But I was prompted to revisit my thoughts on the subject recently when I was chatting with a violin pupil of mine in her violin lesson the other day. Besides being an excellent and committed adult musician, she's also a highly accomplished writer in TV and film and literature, and it's always fascinating to share insights into our working practices and compare notes. It's also such a gift when you really click with a student. I feel like I learned so much from her reciprocally. She mentioned how she'd been working till pretty late the night before her lesson in the run-up to a deadline, and how she clocked up 5 hours straight of writing in a flourish of activity. As I'm currently listening to this audiobook, an audiobook version of Cal Newport's Deep Work, rather in fits and starts, unfortunately, whenever I can grab the time, that idea of working deeply for a concentrated period immediately resonated with me, as I really miss the days when I would stay up late as a student composing into the early hours. Well, actually, I'm not sure I miss the late nights themselves, as they eventually took their toll and led to stress-induced illnesses. But I did miss the flow I found myself in back in those days in my halls of residence. I'm not sure I had much of a social life to speak of back then. I'm not sure if anything has changed there, actually. I honestly don't remember too much of myself at that age, 20 years ago. I know I was pretty differently motivated, at least. But I'm pretty sure that the long stints at my desk were fueled by a deadline from my composition teacher, David Horn, who had set quite demanding and specific tasks, such as, I'd like 5 minutes of orchestral music by next week in full score, which meant many, many pages of 18-staff A3 paper, scoring individually for the 80-odd instruments of the orchestra. And this was equivalent to reams and reams of paper we're talking about here, and often the only way I'd come close to the quota was to pull an all-nighter the night before. But I realise now in retrospect that I was likely engaged in real deep work. And that's likely how I progressed and improved so quickly as a young composer. I really noticed it within myself within the space of maybe a year, going from an amateur sort of fledgling, knowing nothing, to feeling sort of accomplished. I really worked against the grain and pushed myself extremely hard in concentrated fits of work over an extended period of time. So much so that it became part of my identity. I was someone who could and often did work very deeply and with great concentration. It's interesting to point that this was before I learned how to practice and how to incorporate breaks into my schedule. So it wasn't entirely a healthy situation, but I knew that in theory I had the capacity to work for many hours in a row with great concentration. And it's that deep work and flow that I'm really missing in my everyday life these days. When I'm teaching at some point every day, and with the advent of smartphones and endless notifications, distraction is the norm and something you almost have to go out of your way to avoid. Not that it's impossible, but you certainly have to make the effort to find the focus. Until I'd heard this phrase deep work a few years back. I'm not sure if it was from Cal Newport or just, around on the internet. I hadn't really separated the idea of working in flow state versus working whilst trying to fend off distractions in a more shallow endeavour. I just thought of working and putting time in. But of course, time doesn't equal good work or even any kind of productive work. Even before I became acquainted with this definition, Cal Newport's definition and solution in his book about deep work, which I've not yet finished reading, the phrase itself definitely sparked my interest, and I felt instinctively that I knew what it was referring to, and it's something I realised I had already been doing for years, but that was now currently sorely lacking in my work life. So back at music college in 2001, when smartphones weren't a thing, and we hadn't even advanced from pigeonholes to emails as the in-house method of communication, it was so much easier to find the focus to sit and write non-stop. The only distractions you might have to avoid were the invitations of friends to go to the pub. And as I have an innate repulsion of the pub, probably due to my upbringing, spending most of my summer holidays as a child helping my mum clean pubs, because she couldn't afford a babysitter, it was an easy choice to make, to turn down the pints and opt for a hot cocoa instead at my desk. But the thing that stuck out most chatting with my pupil the other day was that she said she had quite an unpopular opinion about disliking the nights getting lighter later as spring encroaches. In other words, she much preferred the cosy early dark nights of winter. And I thought to myself, I actually do know what you mean. I'm all for the warmth of the sunshine during the daytime to keep us hopeful of summer around the corner. But it's much harder to work when it's light outside, and the cosy winter evenings, where it's basically dark from 4 p.m, mean that you can do your nighttime work before 8 p.m. and still get 4 hours of work done. I mean, as I speak, I'm in my very dark, very cosy studio that only has a tiny strip of natural light and a little perspex piece of glazing right at the top. It's hardly a window, really. And I'm drawn to this space to work in because I kind of like this protective cocoon where I can be vulnerable and just kind of get lost in work. There's something about the nighttime that feels so boundless in its horizon. Like the harsh reality of daytime always feels very claustrophobic, weirdly, in the city where the vista is blocked by buildings only a few meters away. Whereas the dark of night somehow melds the inner world with the outer world, providing an unhindered horizon of endless possibility. And it's much easier to access that dreamlike state where creativity flows. I know that sounds quite poetic, I realise, but it's one of my earliest realizations as a young creative adult, that I was able to access the flow so much more easily as night falls. I'm not sure it occurred to me back when I was at music college why I happened to be working until 5 a.m. rather than just getting on straight to work at the library at 9 a.m, having an early finish. it was just quite instinctive. I guess it's akin to why indoor opera and theatre often start in a black box and darkness descends before the theatre of the imagination can start to blur the edges of reality, to suspend time and take us somewhere else. I've never really thought about it, but it's perhaps why I've never been much drawn to open-air theatre or opera in the summer months. We have incredible access to theatres like Shakespeare's Globe and Regent's Park open-air theatre here in London. And I've been on a few occasions, but I always find it so difficult to concentrate on the action with daylight still apparent and the distractions of the real world within view and within audible distance. There's something about the focus of darkness and a spotlight that helps you take you somewhere by literally throwing light onto what they want you to be concentrating on. It's the same with gigs, I have to say. I rarely attend gigs or concerts these days with such a time crunch in my schedule and very limited energy as I age. But when I do, the darkness in the audience is so important to the vibe. The classical concert shtick of having the house lights half on so the audience can read the lyrics for the song cycle or whatever is quite common, but for me it actually totally kills the magic. I was in a sound check the other day whilst on tour with my friend Olivia Cheney, who are touring her new album Circus of Desire, and we were having a very in-depth discussion at a classical venue where the lighting just was not it. And we said it needs to be moodier and vibier and basically just darker. Because I think in a classical venue like that, their default setting was a bit brighter than you really want to be able to immerse yourself in the musical world. As I'm also juggling rather too many projects at the moment, daytimes are for doing, rehearsals and administration and so on, and teaching, and evenings are currently for resting or recovering. Mornings are for my health routine and getting my body going and working. There's not really much space to sit and contemplate or to process all the things that have happened that day other than those moments just before sleep. And I find it's not only to do with whether it's light outside, but how much activity or peace there is in the air. Where I live in central London, at least, there's rarely a moment of peace, even in the wee hours, but the closest to calm these days is most likely around 4 a.m, on my street anyway. Of course, I haven't even acknowledged the darkness at the early end of the day. There are many folk who are naturally early risers and who rise very early at 4 or 5 or 6 a.m, specifically to get some work done before the distractions of the day take over. When you're awake at that hour, while the rest of the world sleeps, you feel truly alone, more so than when you're pushing through from a long day into the small hours, midnight, 1, 2 a.m. And it can be a fascinating feeling, lonely and liberating in equal measures. I wish I were that way inclined, able to rise and work early before the rest of the world gets going. Occasionally I have to be up early to travel, for example, and I love the empty streets of the city at that hour before the shops are open and before life has really kicked off. It's so interesting to notice of late how I have such a rush of clarity just before bedtime, which really is the least appropriate time to start recording my ideas. Yet at the same time, it's the perfect time to record my ideas. It's quite annoying, really. And sometimes I think to myself as I lay awake at night, if only it were 2 p.m. and I could actually do something about this flurry of creative thought. And if only this flurry of creative thought would occur at 2 p.m. when I'm sort of hitting my head against my desk or looking at my inbox and my email or something, some such boring thing. On more than a few occasions, I've slipped out of bed to my little desk in my little cozy studio to jot some podcast ideas that have been permeating my pre-sleep state, not allowing me to doze off, knowing full well that if I relied on my memory alone, they'd be lost to the dark recesses of my mind by morning. And because it's quiet and there are no distractions, and I have time and space to process and get into a flow state, which is sorely difficult to achieve during daylight hours, I'm able to go deeper into these thoughts and let my mind wander without abandon or distraction. I think at a certain point I realise that I make music for the dark, or at least my murky inner world, rather than the outside world, with all its noise and hustle and bustle. I can never quite imagine myself as a festival act, that kind of like bright daylight festival feeling where you're trying to send your musical world off into an enormous, boundless space where you're battling with the sunshine. You might disagree if you're familiar with my music, but whenever I've been at the stage of mixing and mastering, it's always a headphones on, eyes closed situation in a windowless studio rather than a blasting the song out loud in the studio with the lights on situation, in order to fully appreciate the seeds of the details I've planted. I think I need to quieten everything else, and that goes for what I can see as well, I guess. Now that I know that about myself, I can stop struggling to try to fight the urge to attempt to make some happy daytime music as my dad longs for me to make. It's just not my place of magic. I actually would be fascinated to know your opinion of my music, though, if anybody listens to it. Is it a nighttime thing, or should I not preoccupy myself with such ideas? I suppose the idea behind this episode, A Little Night Music, the title being my musical nod to Mozart's Eine kleine Nachtmusik, which translates to much the same thing, from a musical perspective, isn't only about night tracks, not the BBC Radio 3 show, though that is excellent, music ideal for nighttime listening, but also music of the inner eye and the inner world. In fact, on my upcoming album of classical-ish music, Music for Dance Unseen, which is a perfect example of this image of closing one's eyes to picture the dance inside, as all the music was created during various lockdowns over the past couple of years where I wasn't able to respond to dance. It was an inner world and an inner eye and an inner ear that I was seeing and hearing and creating the soundtrack to. On the record, there are actually 2 tracks called Inner Space 1 and 2, which follow on from each other, which in true classic George style is a sort of play on words too, as they were originally written to soundtrack sections of a computer game set in outer space rather than inner space. But the music was representative of the inner world of the protagonist of the game, who happened to be a gay robot called Orby, who falls in love with another space robot, who poignantly loses his memory and forgets the connection he and Orby ever shared. Or perhaps I've got it the wrong way around. I don't actually play computer games, so I had to find my own way in. But either way, as a sort of gay robot myself, that's the deeply pragmatic side of me talking, I thought I should just write the music of my inner space. The backdrop of the game is inky void of infinite space above the planet that you can see from your perspective. I've seen screenshots. That I assume has no atmosphere to provide a sky, and rather than go into details about the music, which isn't yet released, and this not being a specific deep dive episode, suffice it to say that the vibe is representative of some of my nighttime turmoil and overthinking. As for the rest of the record, I think at least 3 or 4 of the tracks of the total 8 conjure up music from darkness rather than from light. I feel like I find it so much easier to inhabit that inner landscape, probably because, like I said earlier, the inspiration for my music doesn't necessarily happen in the daylight. And I have been considering doing some preview podcast episodes of some of these upcoming tracks to see what you guys think before actually they're generally released. An idea in the pipeline, in the works, so to speak. But yeah, I think I might consider that at some point. Anyway, off topic. I somehow don't think I'm alone in this particular connection to the night. It's funny because I wouldn't necessarily call myself a night owl these days. I'm rarely up past 10 or 11. Though perhaps it's because I've trained myself out of it. I certainly remember longing to stay up late and lie in the next morning as a teenager, and even into my 20s. But these days, I have a strong compulsion to get up each morning and keep going with whatever project I'm working on, which is a wonderful feeling, very new to me, to have a reason to get up every day. However, this new circadian rhythm isn't exactly compatible with nighttime work and fits of creativity, So even though I lay awake at night devising release strategies and coming up with album artwork and music video ideas and song lyrics and having epiphanies about track titles and podcast subjects, I'm far too tired to act upon any of them, despite this clarity of the pre-somnolent state. The best I can do is jot them down to add to my ever-expanding to-do list that I have to accept that at this rate is less of an action list and more of a dream journal of what might be. What does become clear, though, late at night is just how important it is to release my music, and I balk at myself for not having done so already, instead filling my days with teaching and money work and e-administration rather than writing or pushing my producer friends to finish the various recordings that are so nearly finished so that I can share them with you all. That nighttime clarity really does give me a sense of what's really important amidst all the noise of daytime. It's at night that I have clarity around questions like, what was I made for? An earlier podcast episode title, and what if this were all fun? Another episode title, when I realised that things were getting rather too serious and grown up. In fact, lots of my favourite music sounds like it was created especially for the nighttime, or even nods to it in the title. For example, the more obvious hits, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata or Debussy's Clair de Lune, both about the moon. For all my astrological talk earlier, I realise now that I'm surprised I haven't ever written a piece or song in homage to the moon, apparently my ruling planet, and whose patterns of waxing and waning I'm extremely sensitive to. There's also some incredibly intimate music by Bartók, the central movement of his fourth string quartet, which is so strange and interior. And while we're on the subject of string quartets, there's Henri Dutier's Ainsi la nuit, and Thus the night, which again conjures this incredible feeling of darkened magic. It's definitely painted on a black backdrop rather than from a white blank canvas. And one of my all-time favourite composers, Serge Ligeti, created so many incredible enveloping worlds that sound like they emerge from the void or some kind of dark abyss, especially earlier works like Lontano or the Requiem or the double concerto for flute and oboe. For whatever reason, these are all pieces that I connected with hugely when I was studying composition in my 20s, and if you don't know them, go and check them out, I urge you. As for songs, I remember thinking that James Blake's first self-titled album was very much music from the dark or in the dark. And in terms of contemporary classical music, Max Richter, a fellow composer of music for the interior landscape, famously created an album called Sleep, or maybe it's 8 albums, I'm not sure. I've not actually listened to it. I much prefer silence as a backing track to my life, but apparently it lasts about 8 hours and in theory is a restful, non-intrusive sort of music designed to help you sleep, or at least to soundtrack the early hours, enveloping you in a calm atmosphere. I absolutely adore Thomas Adès, his O Albion movement from his string quartet Arcadiana, evocative of Elgar, as though heard in a dream once. And whenever I feel a little stressed, I literally close my eyes and start playing that track in my mind, and it always calms me down. I did mention Night Tracks earlier, which is the fantastic BBC Radio 3 show, and I'm very lucky that one of its presenters, fellow composer Hannah Peel, has played some of my music on there, including Two Alone for violin solo, which, although wasn't specifically written for the nighttime, certainly lends itself to evening listening, with its labyrinthine patterns for the solo violin, evoking the inner landscapes of an unstoppable train of thought. If you've not heard it, check it out on the streaming services. It was written for and is played by the inimitable Amalia Young. I think deep down what I've come to realise is just how similar in sensation, dream state and flow state are, and just how satisfying it is to get into a deep flow while working and creating, however that's achieved, whether it's in my little almost windowless box room of a studio. It was actually entirely windowless until the previous occupant, my musician friend James Field, opened this little perspex covered gap at the top, a bit like a priest's cell. or whether it's actually night time and the distractions of the day are finished, waiting in the wings till morning, I feel like I should make a collaborative playlist for nighttime listening. I imagine my favourite tracks might not be on everyone else's top favourite lists, but I'd be fascinated to hear what nachtmusik or night music sounds like for you. It's also just occurred to me, I have a feeling that some of my listeners may equate the title of this episode, A Little Night Music, somehow connecting it to the name of the band Sleep Token, a mysterious, anonymous musical group that has a masked singer at its helm. There seem to be a lot of Sleep Token fans who assume I'm their lead singer, for some reason. Alas, I'm sorry to disappoint any of those worshippers. It's not me, but I have made a cover of one of their songs over on my YouTube channel, Bloodsport, which, in my opinion, proves just how different our voices are. So go and check that out if you don't know it. And on the subject of night music, I'd say their music is exceptionally well suited to nighttime listening if you're in the mood for some intense, brooding, dark rock music. As for me, I think I'll stick to my intense, dark, brooding Ligeti. Thanks for listening and happy dreaming. Don't forget to subscribe, follow and review this podcast. And if you like it, share it with your friends or on social media. You can find me on all social platforms by searching at Jordan Hunt Music, and you can listen to my music on all good streaming services. Deep Down uses bits of my music nabbed from my songs Ocean Floor and Peter. Check out the show notes on jordan-hunt.com for exclusive tidbits from this podcast. I'd really love to hear from you via DM or email via my website if any of these experiences resonated with you, and if you have questions, suggestions, or requests for future episodes. Thank you so much for listening.